Well, welcome once again. This is the Doctor of Digital at the Doctor of Digital podcast. And what we have today is, every episode, the reliability of faith in an age of doubt, why apologetics must become pastoral again, a topic that I've been looking forward to. The show exists to awaken wisdom, speak clarity, and also to help thinkers, leaders, and creators live with a depth of purpose the modern world has forgotten. Every conversation is an invitation, not simply to defend truth, but to dwell in it, live from it, and learn and let it shape who we become. What happens when a theologian, philosopher, apologist, and black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu sets his life work towards one mission, helping the church recover confidence in the truth of Scripture? Today's guest, Dr. Ben Shaw, is part of a new generation of Christian scholars who refuse to separate rigorous intellect from pastoral care. His work stands at the intersection of philosophy, history, theology, and discipleship, and he believes apologetics is not merely about winning arguments, but forming souls. In a culture drowning in skepticism, distraction, and deconstruction, Ben is giving believers something rare, a reasoned, interdisciplinary, historically grounded confidence that the New Testament is trustworthy. Ben is president of Core Apologetics, a national nonprofit equipping churches, universities, and organizations with the tools to think deeply and disciple faithfully. He is the author of Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. With more than a decade of research alongside world-renowned scholar Dr. Gary Habermas, Ben has contributed to and co-authored over 24 publications in historical, philosophical, and theological scholarship. His conviction is simple and profound. No discipline is an island, and the church is strongest when it thinks across them. This conversation confronts one of the deepest anxieties of our age. Can we still trust anything, including Scripture, in a world where skepticism feels like maturity? This conversation awakens something in you, a desire to articulate your ideas with clarity, to shape your message for the next generation, or to capture your life's work in a book that strengthens the church. I would be honored to work with you. If you're ready to write the book God has placed on your heart, the one that will serve, teach, and endure, my door is open. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Ben Shaw to the program. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks so much for having me. That was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you so much for that.
You bet. Well, it's all sincere. And, I was looking forward to this for so many reasons, because this really is right up my alley in so many ways, because this is something that I'm very interested in. So please tell us, what was the spark that got you on this idea of 13 arguments for reliability of the New Testament?
Yes, it came from actually a talk I gave. And as you mentioned, I've been studying with Gary Habermas for over a decade or so. And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's considered to be the world's leading expert on the resurrection. He debated famous philosophers like Antony Flew. He's an expert on near-death experiences, the Shroud of Turin, any and everything resurrection related. He's very, very knowledgeable on. And over the course of our past 10 years or so, he was working to put together his life's work, his magnum opus, and it's a 4-volume set on Jesus' resurrection. And each volume is about 1,000 pages. So volumes 1, 2, and 3 are out, but you can see these are not light readings. So 1,000 pages on the evidence and historical method. Over here, we got 1,000 pages on responses to alternative theories. And then there's a scholarly survey of use. A 4th one's coming out on pastoral and practical implications of the resurrection. So, but what's all that have to do with Trustworthy? Well, I got invited to go speak with Dr. Habermas, and this was one of my first times speaking. And I was like, what am I going to talk about that I haven't learned from him? And I don't want to share about the resurrection, because if I'm talking about it and he's there, you're going to want to hear him. You don't, like, if you're going to go play basketball or something, you want to hear Michael Jordan talk, not like the backup. So I was trying to think, what's something fruitful I could do that's related to what he does, because his approach is typically one that says, hey, look, I'm going to assume, or I'm going to work with those who don't think the Bible is reliable, and I'm going to use what data they allow. But that doesn't mean he doesn't think the Bible's reliable. He does think that. And I think that too. So I was trying to unpack and really synthesize all the different layers and levels of the arguments into a 1-hour talk that I had to have a coffee beforehand to get through in enough time. And so that's how the book came about, because as I was just putting these ideas together, I'm like, oh, these ones are really good. I'm not so interested in these topics as much. but I know someone is, so I've got to include them because they're relevant. Like I'll just say archaeology, for example. You're not going to catch me on an archaeological dig, but I'm very thankful for that work. And so I wanted to introduce people to these 13 different arguments so they could see, hey, look, this one's really interesting to me, this one for me, and then they can start pursuing those things if they're interested. So that's how the book came about as far as that discussion.
Interesting. And let me say, here's a question that you probably have dealt with or heard before, and definitely ties in the reliability. So somebody might say to you, well, where's the original Bible? How come we don't have the one manuscript, that one Bible? And what has happened over the years? Isn't it unreliable now?
Yeah, that's a kind of a common one. The very first thing that, and this is the first chapter actually of the book, is this is textual criticism, and it's not something unique to the Bible. It applies to Plato. It applies to ancient historians like Tacitus. And so virtually every ancient work, we don't have the original. And there's actually a new book just came out by Oxford University on Josephus and Jesus. And this author goes through the textual evidence on Josephus, because there's a very famous passage on Josephus, right, and he argues the entire thing is authentic, very persuasively too. The book's for free, by the way. You can download it for free online. So maybe we can share that link or something afterwards. But very, very profound book. Now, what's all this have to do with textual criticism? And if we don't have the originals? Well, if we don't have the originals, scholars typically look for three things. Just generally speaking, these textual critics. We want to find how many copies do we have? How early are they compared to the writing itself? And then are there any differences that make a difference? Do they affect the text? And so when it comes to the New Testament, it's by far the best attested source in antiquity. And just to give two examples, two or three, Homer, who's considered to be, N.T. Wright calls Homer the Old Testament for the pagan world. So kind of a neat perspective there. But there's about 2,000 copies of Homer's writings, roughly around there, 2,000 different manuscripts. For Plato, there's about 250 manuscripts. Now, if you go to college and you do Philosophy 201, you're reading Plato. And I don't think any of us have heard someone go, how do we know this is what Plato really wrote? Because we only have 250 manuscripts. So not typically an issue there. For Tacitus, I think there's about 30 manuscripts. And when it comes to the New Testament, there's 5,000 in the Greek alone. So that's a substantial number of copies, especially when we compare it to Plato at 250. It gets bigger when you add other languages and church quotations and things like that. So very, very reliable. And if we can't trust the New Testament, then that raises issues for virtually every other text from antiquity. And we only see this issue really being raised because of the claims of Jesus. This is why, because Jesus makes claims where Plato is not going to affect and touch on my life the same way Jesus does. That's not to say you shouldn't read Plato or anything like that, but there is a difference there. So you want a multitude of copies, but you also want them early. You don't want a prolonged period of time from when the original was written until the copy we have today. And when it comes to, I'll just stick with Plato again, I believe there's about a 1,300-year gap from when he wrote to our earliest manuscripts. And one scholar says, this just sticks with me, his writings are closer in time to us than they are to Plato. So we're closer to his manuscripts. We have manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Gospel, of the New Testament, including the Gospels. And the New Testament was written in the 1st century. So right out of the gate, we have some manuscripts. The earliest one is called P52, and it's dated to about 125 to 175 in there, depending upon who you're asking. I think Ehrman dates it. Bart Ehrman is one of the world's leading textual critics. He's an atheist. I think he dates it to between 125 and 150, if I remember correctly. And John is largely or often believed to have been written about 95 AD. So just a few decades, and we have one of these early manuscripts. So really good evidence there that lets us know the text we have in our Bibles, we can be very confident that what we have is what was written. And I like to say this because I heard Ehrman say this on an atheist podcast years ago. But if you're looking for a collection of where these manuscripts are different on the in the text, there's a source you can go to that will identify all these different, like some of the key differences for you, and they're in your Bible. Most Bibles today have footnotes, and they identify some manuscripts don't contain this verse, some do. But both Ehrman and Dan Wallace is the other leading New Testament textual critic today. They both studied under Bruce Metzger from Princeton. And both of them have a statement, Wallace and Ehrman, that say that in all the Christian essentials, there's no doctrine, there's no textual issues in question. So when it comes to the core or the essentials of Christianity, those texts we can be very, very confident about. Now, that just tells us this is what they said. We can be confident this is what they said. So that's one level of reliability. Now the question is, we know what they said. Is that reliable? And that leads to a different level of reliability, or a different facet to consider it.
Can you address some kind of questions that some are aware of? Let's say the shorter answer in Mark, or short ending in Mark. And so the criticism is, well, there's something that somebody came along later and filled in the gap based on the other synoptic gospels and other things maybe from Paul. Yes.
So if you guys aren't familiar, what Mick's getting at there is at the very end of Mark 16, starting on verse 9, they think that this section was added. Scholars really aren't quite sure what to do with this part of the text, because some early manuscripts don't have it. But they don't know what to do with Mark, because the ending of Mark ends with the Greek word gar. And it's kind of like you don't end a sentence in Greek with that word. So it's a very peculiar ending. So some scholars think that Mark's ending was lost, and that this is perhaps close to what was lost. But some scholars think, no, Mark meant to end it there. And so there's some debate on those issues. But what's interesting is what we do find in that section from verse 9 and following, we find elements of that elsewhere. The Great Commission, we find elements in Luke or Acts regarding some of these appearance traditions and going off and making disciples and having signs and wonders attest to the power of the apostles and things like that. So that's Mark 16 and the story of the adulterous women are the two longest sections where there's some question. All of the rest are less than a verse, if I remember correctly. And some of them are, there's a famous one in 1 John 1:4, where it says, we write these things so that your joy may be made complete. But some texts say, so that our joy may be made complete. And so the words are very similar. And so those are some of the discussions they have. And this is what textual critics enjoy looking into very deeply and digging in and trying to assess what they say.
Let's, excuse me, I need to focus 1 Corinthians 15 for a moment and say there are those who would say, well, Paul's experience and the perhaps 500 and some are named in that passage, in that selection, is different than what you find in the synoptic gospels, the four gospels about Jesus Christ. So could you address those? And of course, you've had one of the best teachers in the entire universe to probably address these kinds of questions, which is real advantage.
Yeah. Actually, I think if I'm remembering correctly, Habermas has a chapter that identifies the appearances listed in 1 Corinthians 15 and in the Gospels in a book called In Defense of Miracles, a really well-known book on a defense of miracles, but here he highlights the resurrection appearances as one of those. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 is the longest chapter on the resurrection in the New Testament. So if you're looking for information about the resurrection, that's your go-to chapter. At the very beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, there's something called it's something called a creed or an oral tradition. And it sounds odd to say, or many of us, we've read over the text a bunch of times, or if you haven't read it, when you're reading 1 Corinthians 15 at the very beginning, there is an oral tradition preserved in writing. So this is something that they would preach and share orally, and I can unpack why that is in a moment. But this is something they would preach very early on, and that they were preaching very early on. But it's preserved in writing because Paul is reminding the church in Corinth of what he preached when he visited them. So he's writing this letter to them saying, hey, remember what I preached to you? And so this is why it's preserved in writing. And there's a number of creeds within the New Testament. They call them oral traditions, oral formulas, confessional statements, homologia. And so there's a number of them, anywhere between 24 to 50. I've seen just different variations. And there's some of the biggest texts. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Romans 10, 9, Philippians 2, 6 to 11, Romans 1, 3 to 4. So some very key texts that identify who Jesus is and what he did. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul begins in verse 1. He says that I delivered to you the gospel, which I preached, that has the power to save. So when you're just reading that right out of the gate, that should make you pay attention. Paul's getting ready to remind the church in Corinth of the gospel that he preached, and this is the gospel that has the power to save. And so especially when we're trying to figure out, well, how do I share the gospel and what is the gospel, or am I believing the gospel? This should cause us to listen up. And then he goes on in verse 3 to say, I delivered to you, which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. He mentions James, then all the apostles, and then last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. So it's actually the longest list of appearances in a short statement, primarily because this is an oral tradition, right? It's a condensed form of the gospel. And what's really interesting, this is such a powerful text that Simon Gathercole, who's a brilliant European scholar, he wrote a book called The Gospel and the Gospels. And what he does is he evaluates the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we've heard about the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Egyptian Gospels, or the Gospel to the Egyptians, the Gospel of Truth, some of these other, Marcion's Gospel, things like this. And what Gathercole does is he looks at 1 Corinthians 15 because it's largely considered to be written before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah. And we can talk about the creedal aspect in a moment on how it dates to the early 30s AD, which is way earlier than the Gospels, if it's dated to the early 30s. But what Gathercole does is he takes that element of Jesus is the Christ, so it's who he is, his death for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised, and these things happen according to the scriptures. So there's a context to interpret these things. And he applies that to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we find those elements in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But when we start expanding to the 2nd century in these later Gospels, we don't find those 5 elements. I think Marcion's Gospel is probably the most easy to identify this. Yeah. Marcion did not like the Old Testament. So that whole according to the scriptures, we're going to get that out of there. And so it provides a great framework to understand how the gospel, the so-called Gospels of the 2nd century, they deviate from what Paul and the earliest Christians are preaching. Now, I mentioned it's being preached in the 30s AD. How do we get this information from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 to the early 30s? In Galatians 1:18, Paul says, 3 years after my conversion, I went to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James. And if you remember, there were 3 individuals named in 1 Corinthians 15 who saw Jesus. It was Peter, James, and Paul. In Galatians 1:18, we have Peter, James, and Paul. But Paul says, I delivered to you that which I received. And this is technical language for passing off and handing off tradition. So Paul would have received this information at an earlier date. Now, there's other times scholars give that Paul could have received this information. Perhaps the pre-conversion Paul knew of this material. It's possible. Perhaps he received it in Damascus from Ananias before he got baptized. That's also possible. But if he received it at any of those earlier dates, it would be confirmed for sure at this meeting in Galatians 1:18. He could have also received it in Galatians 1:18 as well, but he would have for sure had it confirmed then. There's a few reasons for thinking this. He uses the Greek word hysteresis. So it's not just like, hey, we're going to hang out with Peter and James. I got to talk to these guys and have firsthand experience. And he's there for a prolonged period. If we look at the context of 1 Corinthians 15, it was the gospel that has the power to save. The context of Galatians 1 is the gospel, where Paul is talking about if someone's preaching a different gospel, it's anathema. It's not to be done, even if an angel were to come doing something like that. So the context of Galatians 1 and 2 is the gospel. And so for this reason, I just think of the acronym ACE, where we have appearances in 1 Corinthians 15. These are connected to the eyewitnesses, Peter, Paul, and James. And it's very early, dated to the early 30s AD, because they think Paul's conversion is anywhere from 1 to 3 years after the cross. Well, if it's 2 years, Paul says 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem. That's 5 years after the cross. And if Paul received it then, well, they must have had it before then to give it to Paul. So for these reasons, which seems like very short, you're only using 2 verses here to identify how this material goes to the early 30s, but it's it's virtually unanimous, to quote James Ware, that scholars think this material goes to the early 30s AD. Doesn't matter one's background, position. Bart Ehrman, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He says that meeting in Galatians 1:18 is the most likely place that Paul learned all of the traditions he says in the Gospels, and even in Paul's writings, including ones he doesn't share. So it's the best location for him. And in Galatians 2, he goes back 14 years later. And again, they add nothing to him. John's there. So there's confirmation. Paul's preaching the same gospel. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, he says, I'm preaching the same gospel, whether I or they, so we preach, so you believed. And if I'm just going to keep going with this fire hose because there's a lot of information. But at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, there's division in the church. Some are saying, I was baptized by Peter, so I'm better than you guys. I'm baptized. So Peter had already been, they had conversations with Peter. The church in Corinth did. So if Paul was preaching a different message, they're going to be like, I'm going to tell Peter about this. So those things could happen. And you go, well, maybe they didn't. And this applies to the group of 500 as well, because Paul's the only one that mentions the group of the 500. It's not mentioned in the Gospels. And I think that was the question you were kind of getting at. What's interesting about this is a couple things. One is where Paul can be corroborated on his creedal traditions, he's found to be accurate. So in 1 Corinthians 11, he also uses delivered and received language for the Eucharist or for communion, for the Last Supper. When we compare that with Luke's account, we find it to be very similar, very accurate representation there. But more than that, we just mentioned that the church in Corinth, so this would be point 2, the church in Corinth already knew Peter and the other apostles. So if Paul's preaching a different message, that's going to catch their attention. But then in chapter 16, Paul tells them to start taking a collection for the church in Jerusalem, and that he will go with them to take that collection. If possible, Paul will go with them. But he's encouraging them to go to Jerusalem and take this donation because there's a famine in Jerusalem to help support them. If you're coming up with a lie or you're trying to deceive people, you don't send them to the source where they can do it. You want to obfuscate or something, like muddy the waters, like Isaiah 59 says, they trust in confusion, right? You don't send them and say, hey, I'll go with you. We're going to go to the church in Jerusalem, where James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So these are some really good reasons why that's a very powerful statement, what Paul gives us, but he's only giving us a snapshot. He's not giving us the full unpacking of this creed, of this preaching. Again, he's also reminding them of what he preached to them. So we would expect that we don't see these further details elaborated in Paul's statement, but in the Gospels, it picks them, and it really identifies specific people, like the appearance to the disciples, specifically because in Matthew, for example, they're being commissioned. There's an important commissioning going on there. And then Luke is ending it, but getting ready to set up Acts, which is going to be coming up afterwards. So each of the authors are doing something a little bit different depending upon their purposes. And as writers, we know this, right? We can't always write everything we want to write, especially when we have word limits. So this creates challenges. And this also ties into, probably should have said this to be, trustworthy is not this big. Trustworthy is not 1,000 pages. My goal was to write it in 140 pages because people are busy and we want them to read it. So not that people won't read the big books, but that's a select audience. Whereas if we're trying to equip people, so my audience is different. So you could read, I've got a section on creeds. And you could say, oh, Ben, you left out all this information. My audience was different. I had to leave it out.
There's so many questions I could talk about that and specific and related issues, but I just want to get some of the practical questions in too that people are interested, like you're a busy person. When did you write? And again, publishing. And of course, you had questions about how do I write? Let's say you have a PhD student who wants to publish a book. So questions along the lines, maybe the practical side, when and how do you write? How did you find a publisher? What's that process like? And somebody else wanted to write a book. What would you suggest?
Yeah, those are great questions. And we talk about these too. I try to share with, excuse me, I try to share with our PhD students too some of the process. And some of it's going to depend on who your audience is. Are you trying to write an academic book, a popular book, a fictional book? But some of them, there's going to be overlap here. So I'll start with the publishing process and then my process. So I'm not a type A person, so my process may be one way 1 year and a totally different way the next.
Right.
But as far as the publishing process, for academics, one of the things we recommend is if you haven't done anything, start with a book review. Find a book that's in your wheelhouse, in your area of interest. So if I see, actually, I'm working on one right now, James Ware's commentary on 1 Corinthians 15. We just talked about it for about 5 to 10 minutes there. But he wrote a book, and it's one long commentary on 1 Corinthians 15. The book was excellent. And so it's published in 2025. So they want a review of it. So one thing you can do is you can ask a journal, and you ask one at a time, because when it comes to journals, you can only ask one at a time.
Right.
And you ask them, hey, this book's coming out. This is the area. Maybe I'm writing a PhD on this, or I have written a PhD on this. It's going to be an influential book. This is an influential scholar. Would you mind if I do a review? And they'll say yes, or they'll say no. And then if they say no, you find another publisher and you do the exact same thing. But you want to let them know why they should want the review, why you're a good person to write the review. Those are the two keys. You don't want to write them 10 pages. You just want to have one short paragraph and maybe a link to the book. And you want to make sure the journal does book reviews. So check on that before you email them. But there's a lot of publishers or journals at colleges that love book reviews. It's a great opportunity for their students. So if you're a student at UCLA or at Liberty, they've got journals where you can just say, hey, I want to do a review. And there's usually good opportunities there. And that helps you get familiar with the publishing process. So it's a really good way to do that. Mm-hmm. Now, a way to kind of get a publication and a half from that is if it's a really key book and you're finding, oh, there's a lot here I could unpack, and you have the time to unpack it, you can ask the publisher if you can do a review article, and that will be like a more developed book review. And so actually, Dr. Habermas and I have done a number of those together. We're doing one for 1 Corinthians 15 for this James Ware book. And so it's a very good book, but it needs some more unpacking than just a regular 600 to 900 word book review. So you can do that. It always doesn't hurt to ask, right? You just ask, do you mind if I turn this to a review article? It's worthy because of ABC. You got to give them the reasons why it's worthy for that. But book reviews are good too, because they're going to help force you as an author to write concisely. Because how do you write a 900 book review on 1,000 pages? You have to learn selectivity, what is important, what's not, and be able to articulate that. And you may have 10 different critiques or 10 different things you think are great. What's the top one that you can say in one sentence in a 900 review? When it comes to a journal article, same thing, but you will typically submit your actual article to the publisher or to the journal itself. And now most of them are blind peer reviewed if that's the type of journal you're submitting to. But again, you can only do one at a time for that. It may be helpful to submit a chapter from your dissertation. That could be a good topic to do because it will be well researched. And you'll be probably the most knowledgeable person on the planet on that subject. Now, there are you may get some rejections, and that's just part of it. I know guys that are well established that get rejected. Some of the reasons are good, some are not so good. You just got to just roll with it. So get used to rejection, but get used to, they could say yes, and what are you going to do? And so they'll get, and if they say yes, they'll typically submit it to some reviewers who will then give you comments and give you suggestions to change. Some will be recommendations. Some will be recommendations that you should do, if you can read between the lines on that. And then when it comes to books, books are a little different. Books you can submit to as many publishers as you want. You can submit to 10, 20, 30 with your book idea. And some will come back and say, this looks great. Some will say, no, this isn't what we're doing. And so But in your proposal, what you're going to want to do, some key things. What is significant about your book? What needs is it meeting in the marketplace that aren't being met right now? And so I've got a book idea right now with another scholar who I'm very excited about this project. I don't think I could share it just yet, but I will tell you there's been only one book on the subject that I'm aware of in the past several decades. I only know of one book written in the 90s on it. And it's just a highly discussed topic. So I'm very surprised. So I think it's going to meet a great need. My reliability book, there's a lot of reliability books on the market. How is another one going to fit into the marketplace? Mine's short. That alone, like that's not even a content question. That's a practical question. It's a short book. So that's going to be a value add. But it's also systematic because I bring together a number of the different threads of reliability to show how these different levels and layers make that whole case. And then I just tell them to go read deeper. So, and I give them there's resources to go read if they're interested in those topics. So those are two of the values of, say, my book. It's a short book. It's very condensed and it's very, very wide in its number of arguments. So those are some value adds. If you're a new author, if you can find someone who will come and write a foreword for you, who's established, that too can help. Or if they can write a recommendation for your book to the publisher, that also helps. Habermas has shared stories about that of students who project did not get accepted, but then it got later sent to the same publisher with a recommendation, and then it gets accepted. So those things do happen. There is some truth to it's not what you know, it's who you know. Some publishers will only take, they won't take solicitations. You have to be recommended by somebody. And so I'll just share with Trustworthy. I submitted it. I can't remember how many publishers. There was a number of them. A number of them came back and said, no, we're okay. They don't want to write this. And I was like, okay. I had one come back and say they were interested, but I was kind of reluctant on that publisher for some various reasons. But then when it came to IVP, this is a key element to publishing. Be persistent. Because I submitted to them and I didn't hear from them. And then I didn't hear from them. And you normally hear back, they'll tell you on their website, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. Yes or no. And I never heard back from them. And I'm like, well, I want to hear a no. I don't want to assume no. I want to hear a no. And I emailed the person who I submitted it to, and I didn't hear anything back. And I emailed, and I'm like, oh. One of my friends had given me this contact, and I don't want to call them and bring a highlighter on the fact that like I'm soliciting with a recommendation kind of. But I called them and I asked them, hey, I submitted a book proposal because I got connected to the editor by so-and-so, and I haven't heard anything back. Can you help me? And the lady was like, well, let me contact them. And I was like, well, can I get your email so I can show you exactly that I did get recommended, but I also wanted her email so I could stay in contact with her. And she gave it to me. So I followed up with her, and she goes, it turns out, this was during COVID, that I guess this person had been sick for months and he just never looked at it, and they passed it on to another editor. And she was like, this book looks great. It's like a TikTok of books. Let's get this thing going. And so she liked it, and we started going from there. But if I wouldn't have made those calls and been persistent, who knows?
Great advice. Really helpful for a lot of folks. I really appreciate that. And also being able to delve into the content of the book. So I'm curious, you got Core. People know about the book, like to know about Core. How do they get the book? How do they get a hold of you? What would you suggest in terms of contact information?
Yes. Oh, thank you for asking that. CoreApologetics.com is our website. Now, one of the things we're doing that I'm not aware of anybody in our discipline doing, I'm not aware of too many people in too many other disciplines doing this, but part of the mission and vision of Core is, like you said at the beginning, is equipping churches, organizations, and individuals with apologetics, which apologetics, by the way, it's not arguing, it's not apologizing, it's not academic. It's just giving reasons for the hope that you have. I feel like, why is the Doctor of Digital the best podcast? Here's my reasons. Man, makes a great host. So that's just podcast apologetics. We're giving reasons why is Domino's your favorite pizza place? Well, I like the garlic on it. You're doing pizza apologetics. So we all do it. But we're trying to use this good discipleship and good evangelism to build and equip disciples and minister to those with doubts and questions. I had a lot of factual questions growing up. I got the story we hear a lot is we get saved but not discipled. And so I wasn't discipled for a long time, tossed and turned by every wind of doctrine growing up in South Florida. And so I wanted to read my Bible a number of times, but I'd pick it up and start in Genesis and I'd be confused by Leviticus and I'd start again the next year and same thing. And then long story, I talk about it in the book, but I ended up at Liberty where you could ask questions about God. And they had people who studied these questions, and I was introduced to some other people who studied these questions. And I learned Paul wrote half the New Testament. That's kind of a big deal. Like, I didn't know that. And I think there's a lot of young believers, old believers out there who are looking to grow in their understanding of their faith, but don't know where to start. So reading your Bible is huge, a great way to do that. But if you don't understand Corinth is a city and not a person, it's going to change your perspective on some things. So that's part of the reason why that book came out. But that's also part of our mission and vision is we don't want people to have to go to grad school to get equipped in the core truths, or we want to help them major on the majors without having to go to academia. So we want to bring these things to the people and to churches and help them really make robust disciples who can live in such a way that they are being fruitful and doing good works and being lights to the world, that people see them and give God praise as a result. That's awesome. Matthew 5:16 there. But this was the part I was getting to. Sorry. The thing we're doing is tying in trustworthy to doing live webinars where we go over the book with me as the author, but we like unpack the arguments together. So those are some other things we're doing too, which is a good idea for other authors.
So how do they get a hold of the book, and how do they get a hold of CORE? What would you say is the best way?
Well, we're active on LinkedIn, which is odd for a apologetics ministry, but our contact info is on coreapologetics.com. You could go to Amazon and get Trustworthy on there as well. You could probably see some funny, there's some reviews on Amazon too that may be helpful and help summarize the book. And but coreapologetics.com is the number one place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I understand you're busy. I'm sure you are. You're a writer, running CORE and all kinds of things, but thank you for taking the time out. Very illuminating, very helpful, and it gives people reasons in an age which is very confused and very noisy and very loud, the reliability of the New Testament. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Yes, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Very good. Well, if you have questions, this is a place to go to. Getting CORE is really good. I appreciate that you're also listening and enjoy the program. Make sure you subscribe. I want to thank the publishers of both Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter, for their support of the program. And if you want to reach out, get a hold of me on LinkedIn. I'm also there, the Doctor of Digital, PhD. And we also hope that you will subscribe to the program. Thanks for listening today. Until the next exciting episode, we'll see you next time. Take care. This is the Doctor of Digital signing off. Deus Volt.